like what is food security? It's basically that people have access to food all the time and high quality food. It has these broad components which include access, quality, quantity. And when you think about access, it also integrates things like if there's food at Whole Foods, but I can't buy it because it's so expensive, I don't have access to it.
My guest today is Catherine Nakalembe. She's an associate research professor at the University of Maryland, and she's the program lead of NASA Harvest, a program of NASA that's related to food security here, namely in Africa. I've been wanting to talk to Catherine for a little while now to hear her experience working with farmers and people on the ground in her home country of Uganda with regards to access and distribution of foods, and also how remote sensing can help in a topic like this. We do hear a lot about how satellite imagery does enable farmers in Western countries, but I wanted to hear a perspective from someone from a different environment and applied to somewhere else, where the constraints might be different. Catherine is actually in the US right now and is working from the US, so I also wanted to explore how she manages to continue to help people in Uganda from the United States. A quick word of the sponsor of this episode. They helped me grow the show, so a big thanks to them. This episode is sponsored by Element 84. They're a geospatial software engineering company that's focused around large-scale impact projects. And one of the examples of what they've done is putting the Sentinel-2 optical imagery onto AWS to make it a lot easier to access. I've had Dan Pallon, their CEO, on the podcast where he talked about how him and his wife co-founded the company and how they're thinking about it. It's on episode 16 and all of that will be in the show notes. With all of that said, here's my conversation with Catherine Nakalembe. Hi, Catherine. I'm pretty excited to talk to you. Thanks a lot for coming on the podcast. I'm not sure if you're aware, but I like starting these conversations with the same question every single time. I like asking people how they would describe themselves. So I'm quite curious, how would you describe yourself?
Well, right now, I guess I describe myself as professionally, sometimes personally, but professionally, I'm an associate research professor at the University of Maryland, and I spend a lot of time doing research as well as working with people from all over the world, which is pretty exciting. And I get the opportunity to talk and meet people from all sorts of backgrounds and fields, and I guess my life is pretty exciting and busy. But from a personal perspective, I describe myself, and I always say this, that I'm a Nalongo, which is a Luganda word for mother of twins. So I have twin boys, and I tend to describe myself as, I guess, like a very hectic, high intensity life with no breaks. So I complain a lot about I'm tired a lot of the time. So I don't know if that's a good way to describe a person, but that's my reality, I guess.
No, I think that's I do like asking that question because a lot of people answer it in very many ways, and I always find it quite interesting to understand what angle people go for. So I'd be curious, like, why hectic?
A weekend is not a weekend anymore, so I don't get to sleep in and recover before Monday again. And so it's, running from one Zoom call to a meeting to a conference, and then in between, you can flip it the other way around. It's between getting ready for getting out of bed, making breakfast for my sons, keeping them busy, keeping them engaged, trying to do some education or something, keep them off of Netflix, YouTube, and all of these applications that have been created, which are great but not great at the same time. When I sometimes have like a space to breathe, or when I'm overwhelmed completely, when I can't think properly, I end up doing something that's a bit much more energy consuming or intensive, like gardening or baking, like impromptu type stuff. So for example, I spent this past weekend. It wasn't a weekend, actually. I think it might have been like Friday afternoon last week, trying to resurface my entire garden and remake it. And so I feel really tired from doing that, even though that's a really good relief for my mental space. But then I have to go back and do calls, do emails, prepare for work trips and stuff like that. So it's kind of like and not very well balanced. It's like very little downtime.
Yeah. Have you kind of always been like that, or do you think like something that's kind of creeped up on you, over time with work and things like that?
I'm not sure. People that know me well, they say that I'm a big procrastinator, not a very positive thing, I guess. So right when something is so important and so, like when a deadline's approaching is when I can just pick up something completely new, or pick up something that was behind, that is not related to the thing that is most important in that moment. And so, I've noticed this becomes more and more intense over time, I think. I also tend to sometimes, it reduces a little bit for some things, but I tend to try and perfect things. So I spend like a lot of time, fixing tables and citations and stuff like that. So sometimes I do, like when working on papers or proposals, we use like Google Docs where like everybody can enter text, but like a few minutes, or, a few hours before the deadline, I convince myself that it's not looking good enough and I want to move it into LaTeX. And so doing that is like something you really should not do the day something is due. It's something you should do before, but I tend to think about how the previous one looked so good, so I really have to do this, and then go until the very last possible minute to do something, at the same time trying to do all these other things in addition. So it's like some type of intensity, and I also feel like there's a lot more motivation to do something when it's due.
Otherwise, you can kind of like just put it off again next week or next time, or whenever you have time.
You sound like a procrastinator. Yeah.
Totally not. That's not true. I don't know where you got that from, but I do feel like deadlines and creating deadlines is something quite helpful about just something like this podcast, for example. Like finding a rhythm has been a creating that, probably nobody cares if it comes out a day later or something. But for me, it's this thing about like, oh, this date's coming up, I need to put it out. And that's how things start coming out. So no, I totally get you. I want to we're going to get into your work a little bit more, but I'd like to start off maybe like a little bit earlier in your career, in your journey. I think I read from an article from the BBC that originally you wanted to be a badminton player, and I wanted to go a little bit into that and kind of what younger Catherine was like, and how you went from wanting to do badminton to where you are now.
So I played badminton from probably when I was 11. Before that, we played a little bit of tennis. So I played badminton a lot. It's part of like it defines our family. So my big sister did the same. We did really well. And so when I finished my undergrad, it's funny, I feel like I'm like a broken record when I say this, but like when I finished my undergrad, I hoped that I would do sports science for my undergraduate degree because I was really interested in physical education. I played badminton, basketball, volleyball. I was a games prefect. That's how we call it in high school. I taught it's like an elected student to lead like a specific, I don't know what they call it in other places, but it's like, like a head girl, a head boy, who are sort of like representatives from the student body to the teacher body. But we had like different, representatives for sports and games and stuff like that, for music. And so I was for sports, and I was like, and I recognize it now more too, actually, because of my sons. So we got them into soccer, and I'm so excited when I see them, playing and navigating challenges that you face in everyday life. So I kind of like try to see these different life lessons that I probably learned because I played sports, that apply in every single dimension of life. So for example, when you're playing on a team, passing the ball is like something they have to learn. Or sometimes you're not the most critical player. Sometimes a goal gets scored without you touching the ball even once. Like those types of things. I see them like struggle and fight. And I think I learned those lessons too through sports. So that was me. I taught myself how to teach aerobics by watching videos. And this is way before YouTube, like at least as far as I remember, I'd never been on YouTube when I was doing this, and like me making up my own dance moves for my aerobics classes. And so I thought that this is really what I was going to do. It was, it was draining. It was hard work. It required a lot of thinking and creativity. And I thought that I would do really well at it. That it was really exciting. And so how my path ended up kind of shifting is when I finished high school, the program that I had applied to for sports science, I didn't qualify for what would be like a government scholarship. So the bar was really high in the sense that the combination of the subjects that I'd done, but then because they weight them differently depending on what you're applying for. And so I could still have done it, but I would have had to pay like full tuition. So I would have had to have done it as a sort of like a privately funded program, which was definitely not an option in our family at the time. And so, the in-between period, there's always like new programs that get advertised. And so there was a program on environment and science that was just brand new. So it wasn't we didn't apply. So you apply the year before you are meant to start. So you would, let's say, apply, you'd submit a form, let's say in October the previous year, to know what program you would do in September of the next year. But then the newer programs get kind of advertised in July of the year that is supposed to begin. I'm just making these figures up just to kind of bring the idea home, yeah. And so I found out about these ones, so not that many people knew about it. And they had a very different criteria, which was more aligned with the subjects that I'd done. So the subjects I did really well and had a higher weight. And so I got into that program. And I started, environment and science.
So did you get in just because of the grades, or were you interested in it, or?
When a lot fewer people apply, there were a lot of places. I think maybe everybody got accepted. I'm just making this up. It might not be true at all, since I don't know all the facts around this. But so as I mentioned before, the weighting of the subjects is different depending on what you apply for. For example, if you apply for medicine, biology, chemistry, physics would have a higher weight compared to if you did, let's say, art as an additional subject. But if you applied to an undergraduate degree in art, your art would be weighted higher than biology or chemistry, right? And so when you apply, depending on how you perform on these, so you could find that somebody did really, really well on biology, chemistry, and physics, but their number one application, they were applying for art, which they didn't do so well in, then they wouldn't qualify for the art program. But because they didn't apply for medicine, which they qualify for, they wouldn't be considered, that kind of stuff. Maybe. This is me making it up. But this is how I kind of explained it to myself.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So you get into that program, and then what happens after?
So I get into the program and, go, into like a basic environmental science. So, and we had, introduction to everything from soil science to forestry and stuff like that. But then we also had GIS and remote sensing as an introductory course. There's an introductory course to, I think, computer science. I'm not going to say computer science is computer science. You'd think about it. It's just like, I don't know, computing or computers, something like that. That's how I think I remember it, because it was so easy for me. And then there was a program that was offered as a certificate program that you have to pay for. That was like an introduction to IT essentials. It was like co-funded between I think the Department of Gender and HP, the people that make printers.
Yeah, yeah. HP.
And so I would do that in the evening while I was doing my environmental science, and during the day. And when I finished, I wanted to do, one of the biggest things was like field work. So we went out and, would go and measure trees, identify tree species and stuff like that, which was always so exciting for me. But also when I finished, we had the opportunity to do like a research project. So you determine how you do your research project. In mine, I wanted to use GIS sort of to create a map on something. And I ended up doing sort of mapping in Mount Elgon. So I did field work with Uganda Wildlife Authority ranges, and I knew this is the thing that I think I wanted to do more of, like more mapping.
And the field work is something that really got it.
And the field work, yes. This is something that has not only influenced me as a person, this is something that drives me as a person. It is something that gives meaning to the work. So, reflecting on like that field work that I did, if I had the same knowledge that I do now, what we did was, there's a lot of encroachment into the national park there. And with the ranges, we would go up and map, like locations where villages are located. And you could walk, hike up this mountain for, I don't know, 3-4 hours, and then you went into a village, so there, people were pretty high up there. And what might be interesting is, with the knowledge and more awareness that I have, is, people were looking at like conservation and like what are the models for making sure those communities, could live sustainably with the forest. Because actually the ones that we met deep in the forest were primarily doing that at the time. But with increased pressure, there'll be more crops being grown up deep in the forest, and the consequences of that are pretty big. So maybe I would have done something like that actually for my master's and PhD, looking deeper into this human nature boundary, but I didn't. And so when I finished my undergrad, I ended up, my big sister was living in New York at the time, and I applied to master's programs in the US, and I got into the Johns Hopkins University, and the program was Geography and Environmental Engineering. So it was geography and environment engineering, but from more an engineering perspective. So we're looking at like water resources management, waste management, but there's also some really interesting things like foundation math for decision making, and being introduced to R programming and stuff like that. Looking at I started looking more deeply at climate change. Then we had this interesting course where we're working as a group on like climate change policy, and that was really interesting too. But what I didn't get through that program was the opportunity to kind of like maybe have like another deeper research that involves some kind of like field component. It's an accelerated master's, and so when I was looking for master's programs, I was looking for some PhD programs. I was looking for something that would, one, allow me to work back home in Uganda. I wrote this down in my personal statement, actually. And also, require a lot of remote sensing and GIS work, which I didn't get to do a lot of in my master's. And so the PhD program at Maryland was a perfect fit for that. But all of these things, from my undergrad, doing my field work, doing my master's, all of them kind of converge, during my PhD, except for one added dimension, which is now I started looking into agriculture. So I didn't really look deeply into agriculture or food security until I started my PhD.
And so you mentioned that wanting to work back in Uganda was a big motivation. Did I understand correctly that it's when you went for your master's that you left Uganda to go to the US and then you wanted to come back to be able to work over there?
So my thinking, and what I wrote down in my statement was sort of my reflection as a person as to what I wanted to do. When I applied to my master's, I wrote the same thing, that I wanted to gain skills and knowledge that I could apply back to a problem in Uganda. So if you visit, if you go to Uganda, for example, there's lots of things that could be quantified, that could be measured. There are lots of issues, and there are lots of opportunities to grow, and lots of things that could be changed. And so I knew that there is something I could contribute to, but I wasn't, I hadn't kind of put my finger on it. And if you think about the work on looking at mapping in the mountains, so I was curious, how does the Ministry of Environment do this? How does regulating this boundary with the Wildlife Authority works? And I went back to that same place a couple of, before the pandemic in 2019. I went back there, and the boundary has shifted so much that part of the enforcing this, they kind of set up this actual visible boundary pillars around where the park begins and where the community ends. But you can see this transition, more and more croplands going higher and higher into the forest. And maybe that boundary is not the solution, because some of the things that I think about is how do we center humans as part of this solution? Because they have to be they're the community that lives there, so they have to be a part of the solution. They have to kind of reflect on the value of the forest and maintaining it and keeping it intact, while also they're able to feed their families. And so those are sorts of the things that I guess I could have done if I had followed that question. But to your question, being able to contribute something, and I think I also thought about influencing or impacting one person's life in a positive way, where I think that, so when I was applying for my master's, I went to the U.S. Embassy in Kampala, and there is an education advisor there, who, I spoke to, and she gave me all this guidance, and just what she did for me really changed my life, in that sense. She took the time. She's the one who was maybe you should apply to this school. She's the one who pointed out that I could apply to Hopkins. She wrote me a letter of recommendation. This is beyond, what her job is, I think. Her job could be and there are the books, and here are the videos, and you can apply. But maybe she was just doing her job in this sense. But I felt I felt that she did such a great thing for me that I was confident or comfortable enough to ask her to write me a letter of recommendation. And so that would not have been possible. And so it's thinking about, with all this education and knowledge that I could gain, can I also do something like that? That's kind of center to, I guess, who I am, actually. I could have said that in the beginning. Yeah.
So let's get a little bit into your work around food security and agriculture. Can you explain just at a high level what even is food security? Because I don't think it's even a concept that I certainly wasn't familiar with, for better or for worse. So can we start there? Like, what is food security? And then we can go into your work a little bit more.
Yeah. I mean, I guess a good segue would be, how did I end up in food security?
Sure. Yeah.
Because that was not on my radar, as food security is food security. And like, as yourself, I grew up in Kampala, and my family's not wealthy or anything like that, but we never, we never went hungry ever. Maybe we'd have to choose between, I don't know, some high protein, expensive thing. Like, high protein was not an option every day or every week, but it wouldn't be that it would be completely stopped, right? So even me growing up, like, food and being hungry was not like part of my everyday thought. In that sense, I mean, it would have been nice, of course, to have like chicken more often than we did, which was like once a year, like that kind of thing. Maybe I thought that as a child, but when I started my PhD, I met my PhD advisor at a faculty meet and greet, and he pointedly asked me this question. Tell me about yourself. So I think he'd, already, of course, read my personal statement. He knew who I was in general, but, he just like came, and I didn't know this until a while later. And so I told him who I was and what I just finished my master's and I'm excited to do this and this. And he was like, why don't you come and see me in my office? So I set up a meeting, went and talked with him. At the time, he is actually co-chair of the GeoGLAM initiative, which is the Group 1 Earth Observations Global Agriculture Monitoring Initiative. And at the time, he was co-chairing it with a person from the Office of the Prime Minister. His name is Johnson, from Uganda. And so when I met with him that day in the office, he was like, so I don't remember if he said so many things before he said, how would I like to go do field work in Uganda? Like, maybe that's the most important thing about this whole conversation, because it was absolutely unbelievable, because I didn't know when I would go back to Uganda. But because he was chair of GeoGLAM at the time, they were trying, it's this international collaborative initiative where if you're working on agriculture with remote sensing, Earth observations data, trying to figure out ways that it could be more useful to broader communities, how it could become more open and more engaging and more useful, but in kind of like not a very overly superficial way, but like carving out like real tangible paths for people to use these tools and data sets in all sorts of contexts, as well as curating and working through, what's out there. Is it good? Is it, what does good even mean? And what is relevant, what is needed? So when you think about what's relevant, what's needed. So at the time, we had Landsat data, but they, have very poor coverage in certain places. There are not enough images. There are huge data gaps. There's all these things to do with cloud. And, when we think about the time then, it's a long time ago, like where we are right now. We're drowning in a lot of data. A lot of teams, a lot of groups are working on producing really high quality things. And so this is what, that initiative is all about. A way of sharing and knowing what people are doing. And so when I met with him, first of all, that the fact that he'd been co-chair with Johnson worked in the food security department in the Office of the Prime Minister. And he was like, he basically introduced me to the Office of the Prime Minister in Uganda. I'd never I'd never worked with any government organization in Uganda prior to this. And so this basically led me down the path of food security. So when I went and met with Johnson, we went and he took me to Karamoja for the first time, which is in the northeast of the country. And there, food security is number one on top of everybody's thought, like in the sense that, so at the time, they were resolving a lot of there's a lot of conflict in the sense that there's a lot of, what do they call them? they call them warriors. What it really means is they're sort of nomadic pastoralists who have sort of been marginalized, but there's also a direct conflict with more agrarian part, the more agrarian part of the region. So there is the pastoralists or the warriors would come and attack villages from time to time and, graze their crops and stuff like that. But there's also this very transitional situation where there was a lot of government support towards people becoming more sedentary, so growing more crops and, pushing them away from being pastoralists. It's one of the most complex places, in terms of human environmental interactions as well as policy. It has a lot of land use has been largely influenced by policies outside of the regions. There's a huge colonial backdrop to all of it. So it's like it was a very messy place. And it's messy in the sense that there's a lot to understand. And so when I went there, it was like going to a completely different world in many ways. But it was something that I was keen on trying to learn, what is the useful thing that I could learn. And because of that huge investment in transitioning towards more agrarian communities, there's a huge expansion program that was offering mechanized opening up of land for crops. And so this was something very obvious that you could see in satellite data. And that's I was like, I want to understand how land use has changed in this region and how, if that has had impact on food security of the region. And so there are all these assessments that are done year to year about food insecurity, looking at what they call this interphase food security, what is it called? IPC. Interphase classification for food security. So basically ranking whether things are really bad or really good. I have not answered your question now. I realize, what is food security? It's basically that people have access to food all the time and high quality food. So it has these broad components which include access, quality, quantity. And when you think about access, it also it integrates things like, if there's food at Whole Foods, but I can't buy it because it's so expensive, I don't have access to it.
Right.
Yeah. So they have to be able to afford it. Affordability is one of those things. Just one of a good example that could demonstrate food insecurity is the place that I studied for my PhD. So Uganda as a country is not food insecure because it's one of the, in broader region, it's one of the countries that performs really well in terms of agricultural productivity. But this one area, which faces more extreme climatic conditions, so very dry or floods all the time, crops fail often, is one that is food insecure. And so one way that you would try to resolve this would be to improve accessibility, which is bring food, just like there are deserts in the US that are not actually food deserts, right? So you would make the food available in Karamoja through, it could be just improving transportation routes and stuff like that. But to add to the mix of the level of insecurity is that the food in the region that's brought to the market is so expensive that even though it is there, it's just prohibitive. Local people can't actually buy it, and they don't have the money to buy it. So that's part of being food insecure.
So it seems like remote sensing would be a small part of that much bigger puzzle of trying to figure out the whole situation and evaluating all the different options that you have.
In terms of food security, some of the things, in terms of food security, so in order to understand access, you have to understand agricultural production. So agriculture production is where remote sensing has a huge contribution. So from very basic things like what crops are growing where. This will give you an indication of production. So we could generate like crop type maps, for example. From those crop type maps, the other thing satellite data allows us to do is looking at conditions. So now we know there is like sweet potato in this region. How is that sweet potato performing compared to, other areas, but as well as in time. So if we know that, and now I'm talking about, purely, if you think about like vegetation condition or crop condition, we're comparing now to last year or the year before. So we know this is what the average condition is for a good yield. If it's below that, it might not be. The other is we're looking at rainfall, temperature. All of these data sets exist. So we can forecast, we can look at now, we can forecast what the outcome might be. And the other is, there are so many things that you can look at. If you're thinking about accessibility in terms of infrastructure, too much rainfall is not good. Too little rainfall is not good for production. Too much rainfall could easily cut off an entire region, so people can't be accessed. So you can kind of, make those, you can think about those things. Going towards yield forecasting and modeling, like if we can understand what average production is in a region, we can kind of like predict what it will be for a specific season. And then from that, you can then model all of these other things like accessibility. And it's really interesting. And there's not a lot of work going in this other particular space, but like looking at the quality of food, there is definitely opportunities there to look at. It's not purely about, it's not purely about there being more. In the end, it's about more of what and for what. So we could be looking at, let's say, soybean in Brazil or corn in Brazil, but it's being produced for either fuel or to be exported for feed. And so that doesn't actually solve the food security situation for the local community. It's just basically being exported. It's not being used for local consumption. And so if all the vegetation is doing great, but it's just corn for export, that is not addressing food security. So there's like all these other dimensions that a basic product like crop type would be relevant for example. And then of course there's looking at like agricultural practices, mixed cropping, looking at cover cropping that could help improve like policies around protecting soils. Ultimately, eating now should not compromise eating in the future. So if we wipe out the soils in the process of feeding people now, that's not a very sustainable food security scenario going forward.
One of the things I'm really curious is trying to understand, like, who benefits from that work. Like, the way I'm understanding that is you try to map and understand the current situation you have right now, maybe taking in weather forecasts to propagate in time, like what's going to happen in the next few weeks, next few months, and then plan like, oh, there's going to be a food shortage in this area. Maybe we should bring things in like that. So I could imagine that being at a more higher, maybe governmental level. Is there also a case where that kind of work helps the people on the ground directly? Because that's probably a very different impact and maybe a very different work as well.
Absolutely. You asked this question in a really good way. It's like one of those things that I emphasize a lot when I talk about like the work that we do. There is definitely clear potential, clear utility, very well demonstrated application at a higher level. So higher level, if you think about it, even from a spatial scale, at the regional level, we have a good understanding. Once you start digging down and being like field scale, it becomes really complicated. Like telling a farmer what is happening exactly in their plot, requires a whole other dimension. And in this case, we've been talking about smallholder agriculture. So now we're not talking about like giant fields in the middle of the US, right? Which like a farmer in the US could easily, have clear indications across all the different data sets about what's happening in their field. So they could have an Earth Engine app that tells them what's happening in their particular plot. It doesn't work that way for a smallholder, because like their entire farm could be 1 pixel, okay, or 2 pixels. And then plotting the data, the accuracy of it. If you think about like rainfall and temperature, with all the gaps in training data that are required to improve like rainfall models, it could just be forecasting my local conditions based off of a tower that is, let's say, 300 kilometers southwest of where I am. And I know this for sure. For example, when I was working in Karamoja, the closest weather station that had a consistent record of more than maybe 3 years consistent with some gaps, or 10 years with some gaps, was 200 kilometers southwest in a completely different geographical setup. It's in the mountains. It's like this other region is in the rain shadow of that mountain where that weather station is. So it's completely misleading to use it. And so going back to the point, about at a decision level, a good example from my own work from my PhD is these broad indicators of what's happening in like this region, Karamoja, could be, provide like early warning and can help like trigger like early response mechanisms. So like, it is very clear as of now, let's say we're in June, this is supposed to be the middle of the season there. And for example, I can check right now, for Karamoja and see what the anomaly is, like what the vegetation conditions are, and say for sure this is not going to recover, because based on our historical record, whenever things hit this level, they never got better. And so we're predicting that for 80, 20, 90, 40% of the region, there will be, complete crop failure. And this is the level of response that's needed. For the farmer, however, I think I probably already went to this point, is that you could package that information in different ways. And it could be, through the medium that they use. So if they listen to radio programs, one interesting thing that could be discovered, for example, a research organization has developed maybe a more drought-tolerant type of seed, right? It's been demonstrated that it works really, really well. You could communicate that through the radio and be like, when you go to the market, you should buy this. It's much more suited for your area. But it could be used the same way to provide early warning and be like, based on the results we're looking at, based on data that we're looking at right now, this dry spell that you're experiencing has impacted other farmers, all the way from A to B. It's unlikely that, without a good rain in the next few days, your crops will fail. So don't waste your energy working on that field. Like, that's like one way that, you could reach like the remote farmer. But, the delivery medium of this information has to exist. Yeah. And the other, of course, from a policy perspective, it ends up impacting the individual. So, if a decision is made that a specific area is severely impacted by a drought or by, let's say, a pest, a decision could be made that we will provide, maybe pesticide. It will be put at these distribution points, targeting areas that are more severely impacted. You could also use this information and data for planning going forward. If there's like drought after drought after drought, ultimately the decision could be like, maybe you could create alternative opportunities for people in this area that, they would not need to go. You have had evidence that all the money you're investing in providing seeds is basically completely wasted. You could divert that and do something else. So there's definitely always something to do with little and a lot too.
You can start measuring like the impact of certain decisions, I'm guessing. Yeah. One of the things I wanted to ask though is what is the reception to that kind of like the early warning, for example? I feel like, that makes a lot of sense. Like you can tell people, don't work on this field because there's a drought coming or something, and it's wasted time, like you were mentioning. I don't know if I were a farmer and someone told me that, if it's something that I'd be like, what do you know? Like, it's my field. Has there been something like that where the reception of that, or like getting it to into the hands of people, and people actually using that, or seeing the value, has that been also a challenge beyond just the data science and remote sensing aspect of it, back to bringing it to the humans and the people there that you were talking about earlier?
So I wouldn't say that I know a single farmer who has been like, oh, that makes sense, I won't do it. Because actually what you end up learning is that the farmers know what's happening in their field. And they have all sorts of ways for figuring out, sometimes it's just trying to salvage their field. And so a lot of the time also the failure happens really early. So, it's like 2 months in of a 3-month season, or a month into a 3-month season, and I know that it's not going to work out. So by the time, we all show up, or whoever shows up with this fancy information, it's always typically really late. But the people who ultimately are meant to help, for a lot of those people, it comes as a surprise, because they're not farmers. They don't live in those areas. And this is where remote sensing is really powerful. So to really know for sure what's happening in a specific region, we have some level of level of confidence, to the level of extremeness of an event, or how people have been impacted. It's become a lot easy now. We get photographs and stuff like that through social media, through things like WhatsApp, and you have like hard ground evidence. But a lot of people, when they're so far removed from a situation, it's very difficult for them, to really empathize and help, and really do things that would help people. And I think that's like something that this is contributing to. And if, decision makers do better, ultimately, I think farmers would also be more responsive. And maybe if they do better, actually, the information would arrive earlier, like way early, way before the farmer can visually tell that my field is dead. Like that forecast would come a lot earlier, when we give, there's a climate outlook forum in East Africa that gives a forecast before the beginning of the season, and they update it as the season, continues. But that forecast, is delivered through, through the region, then to the countries. And so what the countries do next with that is where it would matter. Like that it could end up trickling down to whatever region might be experiencing a certain extreme, or might experience a certain extreme. And so that information has to be backed with some sort of, I feel like sometimes farmers are so disempowered that even with clear evidence of a failed field, they will still try to salvage it and still try to do something. And so without an alternative solution, you just, it's like telling me, what might be good for you is driving an electric car, and and not give me money to buy it. You get what I mean? Yeah.
That's a very good point, to be like, it's not super useful if you just tell people like this is going to happen, but like if they have no other choice, like it's like informative, but it's not useful. Like it doesn't lead to something happening behind. So how do you go beyond that? How do you move from, this thing is going to happen, to allowing people to do something about it, to, telling you need to buy an electric car. How do I get you to actually get one?
That's where the policy comes in, right?
Right.
That's where having this, and I'm not a policymaker and I'm not a lawyer or anything like that, but maybe I would aspire to do that, because I feel like for people who are completely disempowered, it's like money's not going to fall from the tree. Their peers are in the same situations as they are. And so trying to create like an enabling environment, or have some, inventions in that space. I'm trying to think about like, where like the private sector could come and play a role to create like alternatives and stuff like that. But, using the electric car as an example, unless governments put in place policies that make these types of technologies more affordable, because they understand the demographic that they're trying to reach, not everybody can buy $100,000 car, for example, if you're thinking about like the US, for example. But if you think about like, food security, something to bring back down to earth, because I think electric cars might be up there in space. But if a solution, for example, is, an irrigation system, that irrigation system that could support multiple people has to come from a very comfortable backing, in the sense that it would have to be, you need engineers, you need a whole lot of money. You need to make sure that it's contextually relevant for that region. You need to make sure that, water might have to come from so far away. But also that, there have been many of those that have started and failed. Like, there's like all of these things that you have to to work through and then maybe deliver that. Or just being, just admitting that the irrigation system is not the solution. And rather, because if it's going to cost, I don't know, 500 billion to build a system that would, see this community out of the current predicament for 5 years, maybe you'd rather spend the 500 billion, setting up something different that will maybe support the community for another 30 years, that maybe they will not need your help from 5 years from now, So like there's also, there's this balance between short fixes, putting Band-Aids rather than solving. Yeah. So it's like, it's just too complicated is basically what I'm saying.
But it feels like the remote sensing aspect is the conversation starter. It's what allows, at least from what I understand from you, is here's the situation, here's what's probably going to happen with the weather forecasts, and then starts the question of like, what can we do about it? But the remote sensing, I understand it as that, like it opens the door to like, now we actually know what might happen compared to before. You don't even know if anything's going to happen. You can't even start an irrigation project or something else.
A good add-on to this
you're
is
able
like
Sorry, go ahead.
I think it's, you can't improve what you can't measure.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's like what it's allowing us to do in many, 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 many areas. Like have the same eyes, basically, ones that are not, because human beings have different perceptions, right? But if I can clearly show you this is a drought without, and you see a drought with your eyes the same way I see it, through numbers and images. Sometimes people can be looking at the same exact picture. Like I have pictures from Kenya, from this past season with the African armyworm basically eating up maize. I might see it and see this is a complete disaster. And someone else will be like, oh, but there's hope. And so, but if we're looking at it as pixels, we see them there, if you think about it like a choropleth map, it's red or it's brown. It's not like, oh, it's of like reddish brownish, even reddish brownish has a definition. Borderline things will be bad, for example, if, that's what it's meant to mean. And so this is, it allows us to see this. The other thing it allows us to see, going back to the measure, you can't improve what you can't measure. We can see progression, we can see change, and then we can measure whether that change was positive or negative. So agricultural expansion. So there's been, I think recently, a statistic that came out about how a lot of land has been converted to agriculture in Africa, but with very little increase in production, And so the question is why? And are those numbers actual numbers, and what are they based on? So those are sort of the sorts of things you can start to look into. which you were, and it's not possible to do physically on the ground anywhere.
Yeah, in a way that data is a little bit more. I don't want to use the word objective because I feel like that might not be, but
we introduce our own biases once we start touching it.
Yeah, that's the thing. So, but it's a little bit like emotionless. I would try to say, or because. Which is a double-edged sword, because if you see one picture of one area, it's very easy to want to solve it there, and to care about the people in that area.
Triage,
and
yeah.
Exactly, yeah, because again, that's what you see, and so you want to care about that. And I think sometimes it feels like removing ourselves a little bit from that and seeing it again just as a pixel maybe helps take that decision at a higher level. But then the counterpoint from that is, I think we're really bad at connecting with the people on the ground because they're just pixels. So it's probably this really hard thing to balance as well. And I wanted to get back to that for like the fieldwork aspect. Like a lot of like remote sensing is getting democratized, or whatever word we want to use, where more and more people can access it. You can just, on a laptop play around with it. But getting to the field is still really complicated. Do you think it creates, like, how do you think about that, where more and more people can work and get insight from satellite imagery, but not necessarily going to the field and actually seeing it firsthand?
I think, it might be a strong statement, so I'll be careful what I say, but I think, just like policies or decisions that are made that are so far removed that they don't help anybody, this is being scaled at unprecedented levels. Sometimes it's not sometimes, all the time, it's not about the map or the product. So like sometimes I was thinking about like, what is it that matters the most about like the work that I do, or the work that we do? And I think sometimes it's exactly the same product, the same approach, the same method that was used to analyze the data. But the most important part becomes the context and the understanding of the context and the understanding of the use. So there's this word, doing like use-inspired work. So counting how many buildings they are, just for counting them, or looking at land cover change. Sometimes, you could just do it purely for that, quantifying it the best possible way, and that's fine. But for me, I think trying to make it meaningful and useful. The other is getting it into the right hands. So we can blame policymakers all we can, but if we can't communicate our results and present them in a way that is useful for a policymaker to, make sense of it or take something out of it. So like one good one I thought about from our previous discussion is if we can measure how poorly our programs are doing, if our target was to improve agriculture production and show 10 years from now that this whole area is flourishing, if we can show for sure that we have invested, I don't know, a bazillion, whatever, and it still looks exactly the same, or it's slightly better, or maybe a lot worse, that makes you question, like, oh, but like, why is this the case? Like, so money is not the solution. In this case, the data product is not the solution. So kind of like reflecting on ways that you can work with things. And for me, I don't work for a government. I would just share what is capable and what is possible and what can be done. And I can help think about like, well, this is the program you're interested in. This is where data can help, but maybe you don't want to do that, or maybe you want to do it. Oh, it's like really exciting and interesting. But for me, what I find is most impactful is like individuals who become more and more comfortable working with the data and the tools that we developed, who are in actually positions that directly intersect or interact with a farmer and or with a decision maker. So, for example, having like, I don't know, an extension agent in the middle of nowhere being able to go on and look at conditions in a larger area without me being physically there. And like, if they're an extension agent, they'll talk to their community and be like, well, what we're experiencing is happening in a lot bigger place than, it's not just affecting us. So like that individual, like that, for me, that impact is much better than, how nice my map is, you know, because in that case, I did not have to generate a single map or a single product. I just pointed them to, here is this tool. It would always be available. Here's how you get a simple graph from it. Here's what that graph means. You can text me if you get stuck, for example. And like them going back and checking or being stuck and asking me, it means that I've had like some impact on them, because then they're thinking about not just themselves, but they're thinking about like a bigger community. So that's, I think, that impact, even though those are a lot fewer individuals, I think is much, much more important.
How do you think we get better at that? How do you think we improve, like not getting lost in the map?
Maybe why, you're always asking why we're making the map. What will it do? One of the things is like, what could it look like in 10 years from now? When you're doing research, when you're learning methods and learning how to work with tools, I think it's totally fine to explore. And, but as work starts to form meaning and things start to come together, I think we have to go beyond that. But then the other is to try to avoid getting lost in all the politics and all the, larger programmatic, because this gets enhanced even more. Like you find that a team might be developing the same product, but they talk about it differently because they use a different data sets for different reasons, which could be where the funding is from. And so I feel like those things abstract what is important, especially when we are trying to work with people on the ground who do not care about any of those things. And it gets muddled and muddy. And the other thing is having like this flexibility in terms of, your thing might be really cool and you're way behind it and it's awesome, but all a person wants is like a summary Excel table. That's it. Or a simple WhatsApp message. That's it. And so coming down to the level of the people that we're trying to work with, you'd be amazed how many solutions we can solve if we're trying to solve them the way we would maybe, I'm thinking as a parent now, the way I would try to solve problems when I'm talking with my sons, when we're working through things with my sons. I go way above and beyond to solve the problem for them, which is like, we have this language in our house, which is like the language of how we communicate. Like, I'm trying to explain sad and I just make a face. I don't have to be like, what sad means? You know what it means? Like, I don't go totally crazy trying to explain something. I could just like show it. And so, yeah.
I wanted to go a little bit on a different aspect, and this might be a bit of a candid question, but I'm quite curious, like, because you work at NASA right now, if I got
I work
that
at the
part
University of Maryland.
Okay, right. So yeah, that's the candid part. Like, I wanted to understand like how all these pieces work together about helping people in the field. So we talked about Uganda, so let's stay there. And how does that fit with being in a university in the United States? And like, what are simply the incentives, for example, or how do you make those things work together?
That's a good question. So at the university, there is, you can develop and design your research project, and then you can apply for funding for it. And so I'm a principal investigator on a few projects, and one of them is a NASA Severe, which is a capacity building program from NASA. And our group runs the NASA Harvest program, which is NASA's Agricultural Food Security program. And so through that program, it's meant to advance applications and use of satellite Earth observations for agriculture monitoring. And, we're not tied to just using NASA products. It's written in the language that you can use other products to go towards, the question that you're trying to answer. But going back to the university frame is that you can design, you can write your research proposal and want to do one thing or another. And research is a really great space, right? You can learn, it doesn't matter what you're researching, in my opinion. There's so many things you learn that apply to so many different things. And that, later on, your primary job will be directly related to the research that you did, or it might not be. And so when I started working, one of the first research projects I worked on was funded by the Gates Foundation. And it was a sub-grant to the University of Maryland. We were working in Tanzania. And I learned a lot from Tanzania. So everything that I did in Uganda, working with the Office of the Prime Minister a lot later on, was through the lessons that I learned in Tanzania. And so that project had a lot of flexibility because it was also funded by the Gates Foundation. And so spent a lot of time understanding and working with the Ministry of Agriculture there, how they do their work, and trying to think about how it would be useful. And so it's very exploratory. And so going back to the incentives part is that if you think about the fact that we are a global community, global connected community. Nothing could emphasize this more than climate change. Nothing could emphasize this more than COVID. That what happens in a small pocket somewhere else impacts you, and that you really want to understand everything that's happening everywhere, and that you want to do, ultimately, if you think about that, we're doing it for all of mankind. We want to solve these grand problems or grand challenges, and food security is one of them. And so looking at this food security in the United States, which is a completely different thing, and looking at it in sub-Saharan Africa, looking at the linkages between conflict and displacement, and there are these huge crises related to immigration, migration. There's all of these very complex but intertwined things. Is basically where it comes from. So the university is a really great space in the sense that I have access to resources, but that I have the opportunity and flexibility to write or design projects how I see them. And so recently I've been working on a proposal where the way I'm thinking about it is a very collaborative kind of project, working with other researchers at other universities, both in Africa and in the US, not only at Maryland, and trying to look at different things that I'm not an expert at all in, but that are important to the questions that we're trying to answer, and that rely completely on a partner in the country where we're proposing to do it. And so for me, this is me being if I really want to make sustained change or substantial change, not sustained, but substantial, I want to find more individuals who I interact with at the field who will become if you think about it as evangelism, they'll be this was really cool. I really liked doing this. How else can I do it? What else do I need to learn to do it? And so ultimately, maybe they're going to do a master's or not. If I work with a student at the University of Maryland, who in the future maybe ends up working for USAID, they will be, better prepared to maybe work in a different country, or they will approach the problem, with a different lens, not the typical lens. And so I think that I'm in absolutely a very privileged position, being at the university, but it's one that allows me to have access to resources to pursue these highly technical. If you think about the cost of analyzing data, the free part, we hear about free, but it's not free. if you want to do cutting edge research, if you want to, these investments have to be in place. And with a university model, you can even make the argument for, I think this is a really good resource. We should get it. And we get it. It doesn't work the same as when you're trying to convince a government organization in a different country, for example. I'm going to say something that's not completely useful sometimes. It's not useful all the time, most of the time, but it is really useful and really interesting. Like buying drones to map agriculture, for example. There's no way you can convince, there is a way, of course, if you're really good, but it's not worth their time or money to invest in, let's say, an octocopter that costs like $90,000, for example, just to do some mapping, and maybe something good would come out of it. Right. Maybe it's not guaranteed. You can only do that within a research setup.
What do you think is we were talking earlier a little bit about the private sector, for example, coming in to try to solve some of the problems around food security. What do you think is the relationship between universities and maybe the more the public sector and the private sector when it comes to solving some of these problems, like food security or things related to climate change?
I've been thinking about this a lot, actually, because there's definitely a big push, at all levels to have more private sector engagement. And if you think about it from a standpoint, think about the pandemic as an example of where private sector involvement and engagement was absolutely critical for solving so many issues that would not otherwise be solved. If you think about innovations that are required to, make significant differences, if you think about, the levels of investments in terms of trying to solve, it be communication, access to information, there's a lot of potential there. And I think in a private sector, you can think a lot quicker from a research perspective. We can mull around the question and keep going about it. Data is not good enough, but the private sector will be like, this is good enough. We can go with this. Let's do it. So there is that. But I think one of the risks then becomes perpetuating the same things that have kind of continued to marginalize communities. So if the private sector's intention is to make profit, ultimately they will not help the smallholder, because I think that it's upside down to have a business or an idea that is a full profit, but is serving a smallholder farmer, who doesn't have any profit. And so I think something in between where there is protection of people who have been marginalized historically is so important, especially when you think about engaging with the private sector to build products or services on top of these things that then ultimately, farmers will be feeding the machine that continues to keep them in that situation, for example.
What about situations where I feel like now it becomes a bit of a business model problem. So one of the ways maybe around that is if the government is the customer rather than the farmer itself. And so in a way, it's a subsidy towards the private sector. Have you seen that work as well? Maybe to take again the example of, we were talking about private company building irrigation problems. I'm guessing that would also be paid by the local government rather than by the farmer himself or herself.
Absolutely. The private sector would have the right infrastructure. They would do it at the most cost reasonable, hoping they do really good work at the same time, and that it's still so the government's role would be that, okay, we'll pay for this. It has to have this lifespan. It could be, maintained for so long. One of the, other interesting things too is social corporate responsibility, where companies can, commit to, let's say we work in a certain region, and water access is a big problem. And, this is our service, is not water access. But if the community where we have our business had better water access, we would have better customers or more customers. They could do something about that, for example. Let's say a region is potentially really good for growing sisal. It's like this, it's used for making rope. It grows in reasonably dry environments. And my company makes rope, for example. Rather than just waiting for whatever the pre-processed rope sisal to show up, I could, think of ways of, making it more lucrative for the people that are supplying it. The other is if you think about things like coffee. So the private sector could, intervene and be like, what if we locally process the coffee and the farmers got paid better? Rather than them, exporting the raw coffee. Or maybe that's not the solution in that context. What about if customers could demand from their supplier that you've had this like tracing your food, like where the food came from, who grew it, how much it costs. There's of course I don't know how it works, like things like blockchain that have been spoken about as being a game changer in some of these aspects. So if you find out that you pay, I was thinking about this the other day with some friends, where if people understood where coffee comes from and how much they think they can't live without it, and see the disconnect between the two, maybe everybody would want to do something about it. So it's like those types of things.
In a way, I feel like it's about making the pie bigger rather than having the same size of pie and then just trying to shift. It's not a zero-sum game. It's maybe use some like game theory where if we, I don't know, there's many ways to think about it, like lifting tide lifts all boat, like rising tide lifts all boats, about like if we make, like we can make people's lives better and still make money out of it, or like if we're staying on the private sector. Yeah.
We absolutely can. We can give up a little bit more, but still.
That's the tricky part.
I think that's a really tricky part. But like, I don't know if you're familiar with like degrowth. Like, there's a, talking about like for sustainability of the planet, fewer people can accumulate more. Fewer people can't make more waste, and while the majority are don't have anything. So that's a very difficult thing. I mean, for a lot of people, I guess the other thing that the opportunities that have come through my work is looking at different communities and societies and kind of forms like perspectives, which is where that whole idea about coffee, you've had a lot of people like, oh, I haven't had my coffee yet. Like they won't function without it. And like this, taking it for granted that coffee would always be there, is completely upside down, considering if you think, of course, there are people who are working in this space about making coffee more climate resilient, more climate tolerant, more extreme, whatever. If you think about it that way, do you see what I mean? It's very unsustainable. Yeah. I mean, of course, there's another example, chocolate, like when you see the people who grow chocolate that people can't absolutely live without, or the smiles on people's faces when they eat chocolate. If you combine the smile, I always think about like if it was a documentary of like a smile of somebody eating chocolate and the smile of somebody the face of somebody eating chocolate and the face of somebody harvesting chocolate or working on a cacao field, not chocolate, but working on a cacao field. These two things they're galaxies apart. They're so far apart. So like thinking about the meaning of the things that we do, the things that we like, or the things that we can't do without, where they come from, what happens to the things. Like I watch things with my sons, I have to confess. But we were watching there's a Netflix show called Storybots, and it tries to explain, very complex things. So this one was particularly about recycling, like what is recycling, you know, and they go, it's really, really interesting how they go about it. But like the message in that particular episode was like, oh, if you don't, you know, put things in the right bin, they'll end up in this giant pile, you know, and like this is what the pile looks like, and the pile gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Or, you know, like just thinking about what you choose, what you eat when you eat it, and where it could have come from is, you know, it's kind of important that we don't take things for granted, because just like the supply chain showed things like, I don't know, cream cheese or whatever can just like disappear, and people would be like, oh, I didn't have my coffee. So, yeah.
I'm a big believer in trying to tell stories about things like that, about, like you were talking about, like, you know, there you could have a documentary or you show people's faces, and from the person enjoying chocolate and the person harvesting, like that's a story that you're telling about, like you're telling two stories actually, and you're putting them in parallel. And I think that's something I think a lot about in our work of remote sensing and seeing satellite images. We don't see people's faces at all. We just see pixels. And how do we bring those two things together is something I think a lot about, because I feel like people resonate with that more than you tell them a graph of like, look, this thing like line went up and this other bad thing went down, and that doesn't stick with people. And I wonder how we as people who work with that data, how can we take that and turn it into stuff that sticks in people's heads?
So when I was doing my PhD, I'd gone to Karamoja every year almost during the summer, like the peak of the growing season, August, July, August, September, maybe if it's too late. And I always had my maps. I could generate the anomaly graphs and be, you know, I was of course analyzing the land cover change. I was looking at drought and how drought has changed in the region. As I went back every year, so I brought more and more equipment. So like my shoes got bigger, for example, because I was understanding the terrain and everything, and it could just rain out of nowhere. And then I, brought a bigger camera and then a bigger camera. And then one of the trips that was impactful, like one of those pivotal points in my life, was this particular season. I had so much work to do, because we got the drones that we had in Tanzania. We brought them to Uganda. So I had like a colleague come from Tanzania. His name is Sixbird, bring the drone with him. And so he was in charge of doing the drone flights. And I had to collect a lot of ground truth. So we had to go to certain plots. There were like 5 by 5 kilometer boxes that we had to go to. And that year was an extreme dry year. Like it was like really, really bad. And because I was going to be so busy, I had a friend that I went to high school with who came and used my camera. So him and his friend were recording a video of what we were doing. Not what we were doing, but like what was going on. And while we were there, they created like a whole script about like what they're covering. And so when I came back from that field work, I went and showed it to the Office of the Prime Minister. I was like, oh, and this is what, we found. This is the data. And they were like, can you write this into a report? And so I converted it into a report. And behold, I think maybe I arrived from the field. I don't remember what day, but like some Thursday that week, I was in the meeting with the Prime Minister to explain the data. But, we had the maps and everything. But what was most impactful? The videos and the photographs. So I would say, do you see all of that red? All of that red. This is me looking at a map. All of that red looks exactly like this photograph. That's basically the explanation. And we did this like short clips about it. This woman was explaining when she planted, it dried and planted again, and now she has her entire family. Her field is completely dead. And so it was very easy to understand what the data was showing, and it applies to a much larger region, a much bigger population. And this is the situation. And I was told after that meeting, so not told, but like the Saturday after the Thursday, the government dispatched like food trucks bringing food aid to the region. And I was told in a text message that, I think it was a text message or an email, this has never happened before, where, because it's not only, it's like, so for the government has to get political buy-in. So it's like a political decision. And so it's being like, there's a problem, does not always equal that somebody will do anything about it. But that the evidence that was presented was, undeniable, that everybody was like, there's a problem. We all agree, we're going to do something about it. And I believe absolutely I was changed by that moment. I was so excited. I wrote a whole email explaining the whole thing as it happened. But going to the point about like communicating, I could have done my project, my research, went back, did all my analysis, and published a paper, which I have not actually published a paper about. Well, maybe I did. Maybe I didn't. No, I didn't.
But that's not what had the impact.
But the paper, comes out so many years later, or months later. And what made the impact was like, the evidence that I have is so important. I have to share this. Like, I had to share it. And then, doing all this extra work to write this report, go to this meeting that was definitely not on my agenda. I stayed like an extra week. It completely uplifted me, and that's how I ended up being involved in this other project, which was like a risk financing project. But otherwise, it was just lucky. But for me, what I thought, going back to why I went with more equipment and why I brought my friend to record this, was because there was just so much happening. And to me, every time I went back, it was the same. It was like, farmers are completely frustrated. There are all these programs happening, but people are still in, very bad situations at the end of every season. And I didn't know that I didn't look before I went that it was going to be so bad. But when I came back, I was like, I have to look at the data, and like, this is what we're looking at. And this is the situation. So I'd say it was a very lucky moment in my life. A very unfortunate situation, but like very lucky in the sense that I was able to communicate what was actually happening, and I had all the media to support it.
Oh, I wanted to get back to one point you mentioned a little bit earlier about how I think I forgot exactly the role of the person, but I think someone who helped you, who guided you through your education, who pointed you to, you could apply here and helped you wrote letters to get there, and how that, had a really big impact on you. Has that prompted you to like want to do the same thing as well, to try to help other people, like younger people who might be, struggling or just scared or overwhelmed was the word I was looking for. Yeah, by kind of everything, not really.
Yeah. That's been something that I intentionally do. So, when I talk, a lot of the times the people that I can help more directly are people who might be interested in, doing higher education, who might be interested in doing more data analysis and stuff like that. So this is kind of very straightforward. I can help them with their papers, guide them on how to apply, where to apply. If there's a good match between our skill sets and things, like, then they can like work on some of my stuff. When I design projects, I always reach back to people that I've worked with. Like right now I have this project called Helmets Labeling Crops. And the way I designed it completely was that all the partners that I'd met in all the countries would run their country activity. And so, that it's like, you can trust somebody, but there are other ways that you can show that you really trust and you believe in people. And like, that's, sort of something that I do actively. I always, when I find opportunities, I share them. I have this other idea that I'm kind of like actively working on, and on creating like a network for, people who would have been like me or are like me or interested in the sorts of things that I'm doing. We just need a bit of a nudge or a pointing them into resources or having like an opportunity. Because I'm also like overwhelmed. We were talking with Hamid from Radiant Earth the other day. It's like, maybe we can have like a shared calendar where we offer like office hours for mentoring, for example. For, if you think about it from a research perspective, but also, from a whole other perspective, there's like a whole other individual, other individuals that I directly support in various ways that they're so personal to me that I kind of like, this is like something that I protect, so I don't really talk about it. That I've met like through my field work, majority actually I've met through my work. And through field work. I saw a message on my WhatsApp. Somebody sent me a photograph of themselves like, hey, I hope you're still alive. I think it was like in the middle of the pandemic. And it was like, we met in Iringa in Tanzania. I was there. I think the last time I was there might have been like maybe 2017, maybe, or 2018 or something like that. So they were wondering, if I'd kicked the can. And so they just wanted to see if I'm alive. But as, it means that maybe in the moment that I was there, something I said or something I did resonated with them and was positive enough that they would care to check on me, for example. Yeah, so that's kind of how I think about it. And one of my close friends always reminds me to take care of myself so I can help more people. That's what she says. So, yeah.
I want to start rounding this off. And I like finishing asking people for books or podcast recommendations. It doesn't have to be about anything that we talked about. I just like asking because I think books and podcasts, first of all, they travel a lot through word of mouth. And I think, they're quite telling about people. So I don't know if you've read or listened to something recently that you thought might be worth sharing.
So a podcast that I think is a must listen to. I mean, from people with data background and everything, maybe might not be so as eye-opening and insightful as it has been for me, or interesting just generally, is The New Humanitarian. It's a non-profit news. They're like journalists, and they talk about the humanitarian sector and all its problems. It started last year. It is really good. I like it. Absolutely like it. I have my podcasting open on my computer. Sometimes when I'm working, I just like listen to podcasts. I like Discovery from BBC's, just like general stories coming from all sorts of places. I always listen to Africa Today. This is how I keep up with some of what's happening in Africa. I listen to a lot of kids' podcasts for sure. Another one that I think, let's see, top of my podcast. I have Little Stories for Tiny People. But I love
that name.
I love Science in Action. I've been on it twice. Maybe I'm biased. I think there's one called The Leadership Journey. That's also really interesting. I like it. But for books, so I have this one. I haven't read it yet. It's my to read. It's called The Divide. It's by Jason Hickel. He is on Twitter and sometimes breaks down these, very complex power structures about growth, economics, development. And I really like how he explains some of these things. So it's definitely one of the ones up there. Yeah,
I'll have all of that in the show notes for people listening. Catherine, thank you very much for spending some of your valuable time with me and telling me a little bit about your journey and everything you've done. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad we finally did it.
Before you leave, I just wanted to say a few words. First of all, thanks a lot for taking the time to listen to this conversation. Catherine and I have been going back and forth to try to make this conversation happen for nearly a year now. So I really appreciate you taking the time. I bring this up because I wanted to just show a little bit that there's a lot of work that goes behind the scenes to make this happen. And so if you enjoyed this conversation, I'd like to ask if you could consider reviewing the podcast on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify if you're listening to the audio version. There's a couple of reasons I asked for that. First of all, it kind of flatters my ego. Who doesn't like that? But most importantly, the reason I ask is just for signaling to the outside world that there are people listening and enjoying this podcast. That could be for other listeners who kind of stumble upon the podcast, they hear about it and want to know if other people are actually listening and enjoying. But the other one is when I reach out to potential guests like Catherine, for example. This is something I can point towards, and people do their own research, and they can see that people are enjoying the podcast and see value in it, and makes them more likely to come on and to want to come on to see that there's an audience. That's maybe a bit of an imperfect way of doing it, but it's still very valuable. So if you enjoy these conversations, I'd like to ask you to consider at least to go to Apple Podcast or Spotify and leave a review for the podcast. You can also go to mindsbehindmaps.com. You can find a section where you can leave a review. And there's also a section to get in touch with me if you have any ideas for guests or how to improve the podcast. I also started a newsletter that I'm going to send sporadically sometimes whenever I have something to talk about, where it's going to be behind the scenes. Last time I talked about why I am wanting to do more of these conversations in person. Thanks for listening again. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and that I'll see you next time. Cheers.